Welcome to Formed. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Klein. I'm a professor here at the Augustine Institute, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Carl Vennerstrom.
Greetings.
And we are here talking about the 7 deadly sins. In the last episode, we covered what these sins are, kind of the tradition around categorizing sins in this way as a way to sort of examine your conscience and resist temptation. So now we're going to go through each of the sins, and they're kind of paired according to sins that are related to one another. We're going to talk about what the sins are, some ways they might manifest in your life in a more subtle way with some kind of examples from modern life. And then we're going to talk about virtues or practices that fight that vice. So the first one we're going to talk about today is gluttony. So what is gluttony?
Yeah, this is a good question. Actually, before we get into gluttony, this is unplanned. But we were joking, or I was joking the other day, that part of the goal of looking at these sins is to make people sad and angry.
In a good way. Sad in a good way. And angry in a good way. We're going to talk about being sad and angry in a good way.
Right. So these are two things that could be bad or good. So if you're sad about your sins, this can lead to repentance, as Paul teaches us, or there's a form that leads to death. And there's a kind of appropriate anger at demons or at temptation or about your own sins that is appropriate. And I have found those to be the experience of sort of preparing and in my experience of studying this tradition itself. So I hope that you'll be both of those in a good sense.
Sad and angry in a good way by the time we're done.
Yeah.
Okay, so how can we be sad and angry about gluttony?
Gluttony, yeah. Okay, so gluttony as a sin or as a temptation is one in which the demons, these fathers of the church tell us, they have our natures on our side. So to begin with, gluttony, we have to eat food. You can't not eat food. And so you're every day going to face the temptation to gluttony. So even the most holy saints for their whole lives had to face up against this temptation. And so in that way, it has a kind of humbling effect on everyone. So even if you sort of advance and are given these graces in the spiritual life, you can be humbled by the fact that this temptation never exactly goes away.
Unless you're Catherine of Siena and you only eat
I was thinking about her. Yeah. Okay. So there are exceptions.
Okay, maybe there are exceptions. But so gluttony at like the most basic level is kind of like a disordered relationship with food, a disordered desire for food.
Exactly.
But you were discussing with me earlier that Thomas Aquinas talks about 5 different ways that this can manifest. I think we think about gluttony as eating too much, or maybe wanting food too much or thinking about it too much. But actually, there's lots of ways that gluttony can manifest itself. So I thought we would go through those because they're really interesting.
Yeah, so this list is really interesting. The first one is a sort of immoderate desire for rich or expensive foods.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you can sort of think of examples of this from modern life. It gets a little tricky because sort of healthy foods maybe tend to be more expensive or something. But you can maybe think of situations in your life where it's like, this kind of food was offered to me, but it wasn't like organic and grass-fed or something. So like I refused it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this one seems very relevant to me. I mean, when we think about rich and expensive foods, our mind might go to like, the rich man dressed in purple, feasting on sumptuous banquets every day. And we're like, well, that's not me.
Yeah.
I mean, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, that basically is me, insofar as we have access to much nicer food. We get to choose our food all the time. And I think this kind of the ubiquitous phenomenon of being a foodie, which is to think about beautiful, delicious, high quality food, to seek out stuff that's really fresh. And like you're saying, sometimes it manifests as like local organic, which also has other kind of potentially moral implications in being more ethical. But I do think that there's a lot of love for food that far exceeds just the desire to be ethical and support your local community. And sometimes in like weird ways that are actually like the reverse of that. It's like, we live in Colorado. There's lots of beef farms nearby. In Elizabeth, do people look for local farms, or do they want a specific kind of curated type of beef that like checks all of boxes
But
or
it
whatever.
comes from some distant country or something like
But
that.
that comes from some distant country. Yeah, I mean, I heard there's a sushi restaurant downtown that like flies the fish in fresh from like Japan every day.
Yeah.
And so like that's clearly something that's at odds with like carbon footprint or something. It seems to me, but is a highly coveted restaurant with
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. I think this is also a good example where you can start to see the connection between the sins too, because it's not just rich and expensive foods, because those might be appropriately enjoyed. It's not saying like these are always bad or the thing's bad in itself. But you could see even how, especially I think in our modern culture, rich and expensive foods of a certain kind might lead to vainglory. Like
Absolutely.
I want people to know I only eat these kinds of foods.
Totally. And actually Augustine says, so when Augustine preaches on Lent, he basically says like the same thing every single year at the beginning of Lent, like all of his homilies. It's just like reduce your pleasures rather than varying them, which is like at Lent, we might be tempted to eat things we don't normally eat because it follows the fast rules, but we try to eat like the tastiest possible vegan food or like eat fish on Friday that's like really tasty, even though it's actually more expensive.
Right.
And so a kind of discernment like that. And one thing he says to wealthy people, he's like, if you eat rich foods and like expensive foods, you like them, they're like good for your stomach, they're healthier for you. He's like, that's fine. Like that's not the end of the world. But he's like, but you shouldn't be proud of it.
Yeah. That's interesting.
And so he like really like puts his foot down on like the vainglory aspect of the like this kind of food.
You should have some humility about eating.
Yeah, you should have some humility at the fact that like this is a particular weakness that you have and is a particular temptation of your station as a wealthy person.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I like that. All right. So number two.
Number two.
This is one I just like saying. An immoderate desire for meticulously prepared food.
Okay. What a desire. So what is the difference between something that's rich and or meticulously prepared?
Yeah. So I think I got a good sense of what this was in my life when our chaplain here at the Augustine Institute preached on gluttony during Lent, and he said that he said a couple things. So one, like if you don't like mustard, put mustard on your hamburger.
Yeah, that's pretty rough.
If you're at a restaurant, order like your fifth desired thing on the menu instead of your first one. And I was like, oh no way.
Yeah,
like,
I know. It's funny because like we have talked about this homily like repeatedly since then, like the faculty, because it's just like, oh.
I'm still like, no, I can't.
I would never do that. But so meticulously prepared food is like.
Yeah. So maybe think about like something like tailored specifically to yourself.
To yourself. So is like the classic example of this kind of like the rock star in his trailer who only wants his like apple cinnamon bagel buttered on one side or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, maybe it's not like fancy food, but it's like mom makes it that way. Like all 2-year-olds suffer from this.
Right, from this. Yes, all 2-year-olds want meticulously prepared food. I can't tell you how many different like iterations of my son's request for how his apples have to be cut has happened recently. Like, no, I wanted them sliced this time. No, I wanted a big piece. I wanted the whole apple. I wanted it peeled. So rich foods, meticulously prepared foods.
And then the third one might seem more specifically monastic. So this is eating too early.
Okay.
And why specifically monastic? Well, because since they're fasting on a regular basis, they often have, in most communities, have a meal at a very specific time of day. For the desert monks, it was like one meal a day, 3 p.m.
Okay.
So you could definitely see how you'd want to eat early.
Right.
But then I think it's not also hard to think of, at least for me, how this might work in our own lives. It's like getting home, dinner's being prepared. Maybe you're eating, perhaps you're preparing dinner or your spouse is preparing dinner. And she's like, I just have to eat some food. I'm hungry. The food's right here. No one will notice. I hope my kids don't notice.
I mean, as a mom, I frequently snack while I'm preparing dinner or like as I'm putting it on the table. And I had like never even thought about that before as like a kind of like impatience due to like bodily desire or whatever. Because it just seems so natural.
Right.
So that one is actually
and
helpful to be conscious of in daily life.
You can also see what's lost too, because part of the function of food is this communal aspect. So by reserving it for yourself apart from your family or your friends or whomever. Yeah. Well, you can see how pride would sort of fit in there too. That like you're on your own, you're separating yourself from this community. It's like maybe in a relatively minor way, but
Right. I mean, this is a good case of like eating between meals is not a deadly sin.
Yes.
But I do remember reading in one of Dorothy Day's biography that she confessed eating between meals, and the priest told her that's not a sin, and she was like, "Don't you tell me what a sin is." She's like, "This is why lay people get to choose their own confessors."
yeah.
But,
Okay, this is actually a really good point though, because even in the monastic authors, they say often that fasting is a very personal matter. Not that you like keep it a secret from your spiritual advisors or something like this, but that like everyone has a different kind of body, which has the capacity for a different kind of regime of fasting, and so it's not as though there's one simple format
rule
that will make everybody virtuous. What a practice for one person could be a virtue and another person could be a vice.
It's interesting that like you were linking this like eating too early to communal life, because this is exactly what Dorothy Day says. She said that it is a sin because it's keeping me from loving the poor. And so, yeah, I mean, in a minor way, if I snack too much while I'm making dinner, I'm not going to be sitting as long at the table with my family and sharing the meal and tasting it for the first time with them. So yeah,
or even like the I remember my dad used to always say this, like it's so good to go from being hungry to being full, and so having that experience all together is like a kind of delightful thing. But if you have it by yourself, there's this disjunction.
Yeah. Okay. So
nice. Number 4, ravenous eating. I don't have that many comments about ravenous eating.
This is another vice which may be witnessed in toddlers.
Yeah, chew with your mouth closed. For goodness sake. Yeah. Okay, let's just
eat with decorum.
Eat with decorum. Yeah. I think this would maybe be a sort of sin of charity in a way, that like you're not recognizing the honor due to your guests, but
it also seems to me like things like eating too early or eating too quickly could lead to, I think, which is number 5, which is overeating.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, this seems like those could be related. Like if you start eating before the meal, or if you eat your food too fast, my mom would always tell me like, wait until your stomach tells your brain you're full. That these are like little, just like, again, not huge sins, but like little ways that you can be more temperate that will prevent you from bigger sins.
That's right. Yeah.
So then that's number 5.
That's number 5.
Number 5 is overeating.
Overeating, yeah. The one we more typically associate
with overeating, I mean, I know for me, I just like don't think that this is a big deal, or like I forget about it, or all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I ate too much. It's too late. Now I just got to go to confession. But the fathers tend to take a fairly extreme view of how to stop overeating. People like John Cashin will say never to eat to satisfaction, which again, this is a monastic ideal, but I think it can be helpful for us, especially when thinking about like penitential times or you're talking about people's like different ways of fasting. I think this is especially relevant now because a lot of people have a lot of dietary restrictions or health restrictions, and so they can think like, oh, well, it's difficult for me to do traditional fasts like getting rid of all meat or getting rid of because they already have restrictive diets. But if you think about this broader sense of fasting of like eating at fewer times of day, making sure you're eating in community, not eating to satisfaction, or these kinds of things, that really anybody could practice these forms of fasting, even if you had like dietary restrictions or whatever the case may be that makes it difficult for you to observe certain forms of fasting.
That's right. Yeah. I think there's 2 sort of important principles. One is sort of creativity, and the other might be actually moderation. So like these monks are always saying like, don't use being sick as an opportunity to just eat whatever you want. Because if someone got sick, there was the concession that like they might have like some wine or some meat or something like which they would never have otherwise. And so it was always like, don't just tell me you have like a tummy ache or something and play hooky on your fasting. And you can think about that in a few ways, and kind of like the way you're thinking. Even if you have these restrictions that don't make sort of a traditional fast possible, there are myriad ways, and I think we see that from the 5 species of gluttony that you can sort of attack this sin. And then the other one is the principle of moderation. So
the cure for gluttony, if it wasn't obvious already, is fasting, which we talked about, which you can do in all kinds of different ways. But then also,
so then in that fasting, you have to be moderate in achieving moderation, which would be the virtue, and that means don't take on this like incredibly difficult regime of fasting. Don't try to just blow this sin out of the water suddenly. Take on small little sacrifices and build up, because what will often happen, I know this very personally, that if you try to do it all at once, you're just going to end up sort of binging. And you can think about this with different kinds of penances or fasts. Like if you try to get rid of, I don't know, maybe it's a good idea to get rid of like all internet, all phones, all TV, all at once. But I know when I've tried to do that, often it's like all of a sudden I'm like binging.
Or you can't like sustain it. I mean, this is like a workout regime or something, which they're thinking about.
It's a basic principle.
In similar terms. But I think also this is why the church in her wisdom has these fast seasons where we can focus on doing more severe penances and then like hopefully gain some ground for like the whole year.
That's right.
So, if you're not eating meat for all of Lent, or you're eating nothing for whole days in Lent, then all of a sudden it's going to seem a lot easier to like wait till 7:00 if you kind of keep this up. So moderation and temperance fights gluttony. Okay, so then we're going to talk about lust. We're not going to spend quite as much time on lust because, detailing the sins of lust is not exactly a formed appropriate content and maybe not super helpful. But lust is an interesting one because it's actually one that our Lord signals out in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, it's not just committing adultery, but it's looking at a woman with lust. And so there is this, like with all these capital vices we've been talking about, this kind of deeper examination of conscience about what these sins are and how they manifest themselves. So do the monks have a kind of helpful definition of lust or something to say about lust?
Yeah, I think there's some good principles to take from these monks. The first kind of to pair with gluttony is that the demons in this temptation, they have nature on their side. So God created us, and with the design that the human race would continue through procreation, and so we have sexual desires that will bring that about, and so the relationship between the soul and the body is broken, and so and this is something from Augustine, right? The body is disobedient to the soul. And this is manifested especially with lust. And so actually the virtue of humility is extremely important, which I think is really interesting.
That's really interesting. Yeah, say more about that.
Yeah. So you might think so there are sort of practical advice, but this is another demon that sort of lasts forever. It continues to attack you. And so the solution is not just to sort of grit your teeth and force yourself to be virtuous, but first acknowledge your weakness and sort of cry out for the grace and mercy of God. And you get a really beautiful sort of analysis of that in St. John of Damascus, this Greek monk, or Greek-speaking monk. So I think this is really helpful. And then there's more practical advice, which requires a bit of translation, I think. So especially with these monks, what's often recommended is to restrict the amount of time you spend in conversation with women. All right. So
you're already breaking that rule.
Yeah, I know. We're talking. I should have read my John Cash more carefully.
But I think this is helpful, combining with the humility with limiting it, because with food, you can't give it up entirely, but there are things that you can give up entirely pertaining to this particular sin. And so
That's right.
You have to have the humility to say, I can't watch this show. I can't, because I think
which actually another person might be able to.
Another person might, without
yeah.
putting him or herself at any risk. There might be certain activities that you can't do, and this might be true too if you're in a marriage and there's like a certain person that you spend time around and it causes your affections to stray. You might just have to be like, I just have to have the humility to say, like, I can't do this. I have to like just completely cut this out of my life. And I think particularly, obviously, there are clear forms of entertainment that are out of bounds in terms of this sin. But I think just in the society that we live in, this is nobody in the entertainment industry is thinking like, oh, is this going to like provoke lust? I probably should not like include this, right? This is not what they're thinking about. And so we have to be on our conscience to say like there are certain, whole TV networks that are probably not the greatest to watch if you're tempted by this sin and these kinds of things. And I just have the humility to say no.
Yeah, right. And as sort of an auxiliary to this, I think it's important to avoid, I don't know what to call it exactly, like a sort of spiritualism where it's like, all right, we're entering this life of prayer and, our spirit and our soul are higher than our body. So we're beginning to live this angelic life in the church and everything. So eventually probably just be sort of like beyond these temptations.
Right, because no monk is ever beyond this temptation. This is very clear and it's something that they talk about. And so, having the humility to say like, I'm never going to not have to like think about this at all. Yeah,
and so you have to make plans to deal with it. It's not just something that you can plan to have go away. It's a sort of constant striving. And that's I think that's an important part of the bit about humility that like this is something you're always going to need help with.
Right. And as a final exhortation, if you've studied Roman antiquity at all, you will know that their temptations to lust were not necessarily so dramatically different. Like sometimes we think our own society is like so depraved and there's so much out there like, the Romans were pretty bad. They were pretty bad.
Yes.
And things like adultery were extremely common in the Roman world. So
it wasn't quite a virtue, but it was like almost a virtue.
Yeah, it really was. And I mean, if you've read Augustine's Confessions, you will know this. So he's a good patron to look for regarding this particular sin. But, we're through the exciting sins of gluttony and lust. So these were the kinds of some of the kind of bodily sins. And we'll be moving on to avarice in the next episode. So I hope you join us in continuing to examine your conscience.